He leaned in like he already owned the moment and the room. "Today is the best day of my life," he said, loud enough that a few heads turned. "I am taking everything from you." It was the kind of line meant to be both a hammer and a show. Kevin's grin had always been calibrated for an audience. The tilt of the jaw, the practiced ease, the casual eye contact that said, "I win." He smelled like the aftershave he'd bought that week, cedar and something metallic. Sophie stood beside him, smiling in that way people smile when they know they're being photographed for a future story. The courthouse hallway felt too bright. I folded my coat around me and said nothing. People expect that kind of moment to ruin you. They imagine shouting, dramatic scenes, a phone call to a friend that ends in tears. That didn't happen. I did not scream. I did not make a spectacle. I watched him finish his sentence, watched his chest lift with triumph, and tucked his words into a pocket of quiet I had spent years practicing. The thought that moved through me felt less like fury and more like measurement. How long has he been counting on winning by noise? If this resonates, tap like. Someone may need to hear this. We had been living two truths under one roof for years. The one everyone saw was Kevin, the confident husband, the man who brought guests to our home and made the rounds at charity evenings. He told the stories. He owned the anecdotes. He was, in the public rooms of our life, the provider. The other truth belonged to me. In the rooms with less light, I kept the books. I tracked payroll for a small medical practice, reconciled 3 separate business accounts, balanced our household budget, and handled the forms no one wanted to read. Numbers were that part of me I did not advertise at parties. I liked it that way. Dinner parties offered a small theater of this arrangement. Kevin would laugh loud at a joke and take credit for some clever investment idea. I would stand at the kitchen island later and reconcile the card charges from the evening, the extra bottle of wine, the unexpected tip, the last-minute reservation made in his name. I kept receipts in labeled envelopes, utilities, mortgage, repairs, the car. I saw patterns other people missed because I read the small things for a living, the rhythms in a bank feed, the cadence of a payroll file, the way someone's spending accelerates before they disappear. There were subtle signs. A hotel charge here. A transfer out to a payee with an unfamiliar name there. A dinner he claimed was for the company that had a solo receipt in a small town I'd never heard him mention. The money never felt like the point in our arguments then. It was always the tone. But numbers, unlike voices, do not lie very well. They accumulate. They create a paper trail you can follow back to the person who left the crumbs. I noticed the small things because that was what I did. I noticed the empty bottle in the recycling and where he had tossed the receipt. I noticed Sophie's presence at events, always a second chair, the efficient assistant, the woman with the bright hair who laughed at his jokes. I could have ignored the little inconsistencies. I could have let the polite narrative of marriage pad the edges of the discrepancy until it blurred. Instead, a rainy Tuesday changed the calculus. It started with a jacket. Kevin had thrown it over the back of a chair when he came home, breathless and flushed from an errand. I was at the dining table with spreadsheets open, the laptop glow pooling on my face. The rain outside made the streetlights smear. I reached for a pen and, without thinking, checked the pocket because there is a certain habit that comes with years of reconciling. Hands go to pockets, eyes go to corners. Everything small has a place. I found a receipt. It was tucked into the cotton, like it had been shoved there to be forgotten. The store name was familiar in the way luxury shops are. A small printed logo, a 4-digit transaction number, and an amount that made the number of decimal points look obscene. $5,000. The paper smelled faintly of perfume as if a bracelet had brushed against it. There was a line item for a bluestone bracelet, described in a clear, clinical way that made it feel both precious and absurd. I held the paper between 2 fingers and did not feel anything the way people imagine grief. I felt a quiet, precise shift. Men do not always leave receipts for their secrets. Men who think they are careful sometimes assume someone will not notice the language of numbers. I did. I put the receipt on the table and closed my laptop. I did not call him into the room. I did not accuse. I moved through the house the way someone wearing the skin of a neutral observer might. I walked past his study, past the photos where we smiled with our mouths open and our eyes tired, and I reached for my phone. Sophie's social feed appeared like an answer. A bright photo of Sophie with her arm up, a bracelet flashing on her wrist, captioned with a laughing emoji and a note about little celebrations. The bracelet matched the receipt. I did not cry. I started a spreadsheet. There is a certain work that grief and betrayal can be converted into, if you give it time and let your hands do what the heart cannot yet tell. My first file was not called revenge. I called it balance. It had 3 tabs: income, expenses, and transfers. I opened bank portals I knew by habit. For 3 years I extracted statements, local banks, the small business accounts I managed, the joint credit cards. I printed, I searched, I highlighted. I made columns for dates, amounts, payees, and notes. I made a column called Why for each line that read like it might be frivolity, trivialized as something else. Company, gift, personal. The pattern appeared because numbers always make patterns when you look long enough. There were transfers out on Fridays at midnight to a payee that mapped to the same timing as his bonus payments. There were regular draws to accounts labeled as entertainment and travel that coincided with hotel stays in a neighboring city. A particular set of transfers led to a betting site. The amounts increased around events he had always called work trips. There were also small, steady payments. Reimbursements I had made for the mortgage from my separate savings after he had told me it's covered. The inheritance my mother had left me 3 years earlier, meant to be a quiet cushion, had been used to cover months when the mortgage had been missed on his end. The money funneling into his account did not always come from him. I made another tab, gifts. I traced the $5,000 bracelet back to a series of dinner charges and florists that aligned with expenses I could account for in our joint accounts. When Sophie's bright post popped up again, there were 2 names in the comments, Kevin and Kay. The comment thread read like a private conversation played in public. The bracelet photo, the receipt, the transfers, all of it fit together with a clarity that was both practical and cold. At no point did I set out to make a spectacle. My work was a series of small, patient moves. I copied bank statements and organized them. I made color-coded charts. I used pen and highlighter until the pages looked like maps. I did not tell a friend. I did not confront him with a printed list. Instead, I reached out to a lawyer I had met once through a client. Harold Whitman had a modest office, a slow voice, and a reputation for not needing the drama of court. When he read what I sent him, he nodded in that way lawyers do when they see a clean thread. "You did the work," he said. "That's more than half the case." He was right. What I had done, organized, labeled, amassed, was evidence. But evidence is a fragile thing. It must be framed. Harold's plan was not flashy. He refused melodrama. He refused the temptation to make the courtroom a theater of accusation. His strategy was simple. Let the records speak, and don't let Kevin speak unless he had to. If he tried to perform, the next move would be to let his words be checked against the ledger. The goal was to remove the story and replace it with truth. "You'll have to be patient," Harold told me. "The law moves on procedure. We move on documentation. You did that. Now we file, we produce, and we wait for him to explain himself in front of the ledger." I liked the metaphor. The ledger never lied. The months before the filing felt like waiting for a train you could see in the distance. We filed the petition. Kevin did what he had always done. He hired an aggressive attorney, gave interviews that painted me as difficult, and posted carefully curated images where he looked calm and successful. He continued to live in the rhythm of performative ownership. I continued to layer evidence. I collected airline receipts matched to hotel invoices. I subpoenaed banking records where necessary. I worked with a forensic accountant Harold recommended to trace transfers that leapt across accounts and reappeared in the feed of a gambling site. There were patterns of dissipation that fit a consistent arc. Funds moved out under the guise of business expenses, then into accounts that funded personal indulgences. The accounts were not always direct, and they were not always neatly labeled, but the direction was clear. I learned in those months the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from turning a private wound into an instrument of truth. There were nights I slept with my laptop on, screens dimmed, spreadsheets open like a map of the past. There were other nights I left everything on the kitchen table and went for walks until the dark blurred the city's edges. I allowed myself small breaks, a cup of tea with the blanket pulled up to my chin, the tidy domestic pleasures that had been mine all along. Kevin's campaign of outward confidence continued, like drumbeat. He would arrive at charity events with Sophie at his side and make some grand statement about the future. He assumed he had framed the story. I did not speak about these nights. I let the work make the sound. Numbers do not beg. They wait. They are relentless in the way they corroborate. Then came the day of the hearing, which had a momentum all its own. Courthouses have a smell, a combination of old wood, lemon cleaner, and the slightly sterile tang of air conditioning. People shuffle. Papers rustle. There is a hum of muted grievances moving through the building. I sat in the back with my files in a leather folder. Harold sat beside me with a similar folder that looked like a small, ordered life. Kevin arrived with an entourage, his lawyer, Sophie, and a hush of confidence. He was in a suit that fit like he was still giving an audition for control. His smile was calibrated. For a moment, the muscle memory of marriage made me look for the man I had once believed I knew. Harold's presentation was quiet until it did not need to be. He began with the inheritance because it was a clear thread and also a moral one. This sum, he said, placing a single sheet on the table, was received by Ms. Bennet as a separate asset. Documents show repeated transfers from Miss Bennet's savings into joint account payments covering the mortgage, at times when Mr. Bennet's contributions were absent. He spoke of dissipation in careful phrases, the sort of language that feels technical but carries weight. He showed the bracelet receipt. He displayed Sophie's social post with the timestamp that matched the transaction. He put hotel invoices on the table and bank entries that led, like breadcrumbs, to a gambling site. He did not say he cheated. He did not need to. The records did the speaking. Each piece of paper was another witness that did not tremble. Kevin's attorney tried the predictable counters: character framing, claims of business expenses, a question about timing. Kevin himself was called to answer a question about a transfer. For a moment he did what he always did. He performed confidence. He smiled and tried to make a joke. Then Harold slid a spreadsheet across the table. The cells were simple: dates, amounts, payees. The juxtaposition was clinical. The spreadsheet asked a question he could not laugh down. Where did these funds go, and why were they missing from accounts that had been relied upon for months? His expression changed. The showmanship fell away first from his features and then from the room. The arrogance that had buoyed him on the courthouse steps was suddenly a curio in the observation of facts. He tried to explain a few entries, his voice small against the accumulation of proof. Harold let him try. Then, with a quiet thoroughness, Harold connected a series of transfers to purchases, and then to the bracelet receipt. He connected the inheritance's shortfalls to mortgage payments that came from my savings. He traced patterns of transfers out during bonus weeks to a gambling account. It was not an accusation, it was an accounting. I watched Kevin's face tighten, the way muscle tenses when a lie meets gravity. Sophie's smile, in the gallery, had its edges pried apart by a growing awareness. The judge asked questions in the kind of voice courthouses know, even, procedural, precise. "Can you explain this transfer?" Harold would ask. "Can you account for this transaction?" the judge would ask. The room became increasingly populated by small, incontrovertible things: timestamps, bank names, invoice numbers. The narrative Kevin had hoped to stage unraveled not by spectacle, but by the steady, patient labor of documentation. When the ruling came, it was measured. The judge did not seize the moment for theatricality. He evaluated the evidence as evidence must be evaluated. The condo, he said, had been acquired with funds traceable to Miss Bennet's separate estate, and therefore could be considered separate property under the circumstances shown. He ordered reimbursement for certain sums that had been dissipated during the marriage and recommended further financial review. He made no sweeping moral statement about Kevin's character. Courts do not mete out poetic justice. They respond to proof. Kevin made one last attempt at a posture of injury, a public face he likely rehearsed in the mirror, but it landed like an afterthought. Outside the courtroom, the consequences began as quiet and procedural. His employer called, asking questions that were not about marriage anymore, but about transactions flagged in an internal review. Sophie suddenly became less visible. The gossip that had fed his story found different prey. How could a man whose private ledger contradicted his persona have kept both? There was relief. There was a bureaucratic victory. But there was also a lightness that surprised me. It was not triumph. It was the feeling of a burden sliding free. The documents I had gathered until the late hours were no longer a conspiracy. They were the things that let me stand and be heard. The quiet revenge I had thought about was not a theatrical unmasking. It had been the slow reclaiming of agency through endurance and proof. People sometimes ask me if I felt rage in that moment. Rage is a large word. There was disappointment and a catalogue of small betrayals that had happened in the hours between breakfast and bed. But the predominant feeling was a precise kind of closure. I had acted in accordance with the only thing that mattered to me, the truth of the accounts. My work had been ordinary and patient, and paid for by days and nights of quiet diligence. If revenge is measured in satisfying the thirst for seeing someone fall, this was not that. If revenge is measured in returning to the life you were supposed to have, reclaimed and unburdened, then maybe it was. Out on the courthouse steps, the sky had thawed into a cautious afternoon. I walked without hurry. There was no soundtrack, only the city's ordinary sounds. Sophie passed by, looking at me the way someone catches a reflection of themselves in a shop window and sees an unrecognizable face. Kevin avoided my eyes. His entourage had emptied into the street and into a narrative that no longer matched what people could document. A few weeks later, the professional consequences tightened. His employer initiated an internal inquiry after being presented with the documentation. I cannot pretend legal paths are linear or that every judge would decide the same way. I can only tell you what happened in our case. The court acknowledged the pattern of dissipated assets and allocated the condo as separate property, and the reimbursement order was entered. The company made decisions that reflected its own policies. Those were not reparations of the soul. They were the practical, necessary things that followed when a ledger contradicted a life. I did not gloat at his misfortune. I did not post anything about the rulings on social media. I had no appetite for further spectacle. I returned to the ordinary life of opening mail, paying bills from the account that was mine, and organizing the space in my home in a way that felt right. The house felt different because the things in it were no longer weighted with the same unspoken compromises. There was a domestic calm that comes from clarity. There was another kind of aftermath I had not anticipated. Friends I had not spoken to in months reached out with small, steady messages. Some asked how I was. A couple asked for help organizing their own finances. I did not give advice beyond listening and pointing them to professionals when it mattered. One woman, single, a neighbor, asked me to help her set up a bill pay system because she was tired of surprises. I did it. We made a simple spreadsheet together. Watching her feel steadier felt like an extension of the work that had saved me, teaching someone to see the small things before they become a pattern. I sometimes think about the phrase Kevin used in that courthouse hallway. He said he would take everything. He thought taking meant possession, and that he would walk out celebratory with the spoils. He did not understand that some things do not belong in a man's chest. Independence, competency, the ability to stand in front of a room and let facts speak. In the end, he left with less than he thought he was losing. Not because I took it from him in theatrics, but because the truth untethered certain illusions. There is no neat moral to disasters. There is no single method that turns betrayal into vindication. What there was, for me, was a long sequence of small, ordinary acts that added up into something firm: attention, organization, and patience. I made color-coded charts. I traced transfers. I bought a new set of pens and labeled a drawer. I hired a lawyer who did not like fanfare and preferred evidence. Those are not heroic acts. They are the work of someone who refuses to be defined by someone else's narrative. When I walk past the place where his jacket used to hang, I do not feel triumph so much as a lightness. The house is quieter in a different way. I make tea in the mornings and sit with a stack of papers that say what I need to know. I have a smaller digital file called Balance, and when I open it now, there is less to reconcile. There is a sense of forward motion that is steady and slow, like the hint of a tide. I used to think revenge required fury. It does not. Sometimes revenge is a ledger that refuses to be silenced. Sometimes it is the small, patient work of turning hurt into clarity until the truth, inescapable, reveals itself. I did not need to make a speech to the world. I simply did the work I had always done privately and let the records do what they are supposed to do. He swore to take everything from me. He left with less than he thought he would lose. If you want more stories about quiet strength and the ways truth shows up, subscribe for more.